talking about the movie simply called Aaran. This one is written and directed by Joseph Mazzaferro. Now, this is more of a drama than a horror, although it kind of is marketed like a horror movie, and there are a couple of gore scenes in here, but it's really a drama with kind of a very kind of light touch of horror. And it's a fairly bizarre film that I think most people will hate. However, there is something to be said here for I think the message that it's trying to kind of put across. So the story focuses on this woman called Anne, played by Gail Yost, and she is an elderly woman who seems to have some kind of mental anxiety, some kind of severe type of mental trauma that has happened in her past, and towards the end of the movie you kind of learn what that is. And she's essentially living on her own in this kind of like house, surrounded by all of these dolls, which she kind of fusses over and kind of talks to. And really the first two acts of this movie, so the majority of the running time, is essentially Anne kind of in this house, just really kind of with the film showing us that she's some kind of mentally unstable in a variety of different kind of ways. Now, it's kind of subtly hinted at, is there something going on, or are we just to believe that she is kind of, has some kind of mental issues? Now, unusually with these films, when you kind of see that, you think, oh, well, we know it's going to be a ghost story because it's the film and stuff, but here, you actually think the latter, you actually think it's, oh, she probably really is mentally disabled and kind of, is really having a hard time, and sort of there's nothing going on here, it's just kind of like her kind of behaviour that's kind of causing this, because the film really hammers home the fact that she has got some severe mental problems. So really the first two acts of this movie is just that. Very little dialogue. Then the plot really kind of starts to happen in the last acts, and this is where we have this kind of like live-in nurse that kind of like decides that after an accident is going to kind of live with her. And then we have her and her kind of youngest son sort of clashing over the kind of her care and stuff. And that's when you think, oh, maybe there is something going on here, but still maybe there isn't. This movie never really kind of confirms it either way. You'll start to think maybe there is something going on, but then the movie ends on a note where you think, oh, maybe there wasn't something after all. So it's kind of, it's a bit of a bizarre one. But I think this movie, on the plus side, this is really a kind of a good example of what happens when someone gets older and is kind of is desperately in need of care, and kind of it shows you the kind of like almost a glimpse in a world where it's just this crippling kind of like loneliness and kind of isolation, coupled with kind of like mental trauma, just leads a person to kind of really go off the kind of the deep end and what that kind of life is like. So you're watching this expecting a horror film, and it'll actually kind of give you like a kind of almost like a lesson in what it's like in dementia. So I think it's interesting in that regard. However, don't get me wrong, if you're watching this for an entertaining movie, or if you are watching this for a horror film, then you will find this incredibly boring. This movie, I mean, like I've said, the bulk of the running time, and it's like an hour and 20 minutes, so I would say like 50 of those minutes are spent really just showing you kind of Anne having kind of like conversations with dolls and playing with stuff, and that's it. It didn't need to be that long. I don't think it needed to be that kind of length of time to establish the fact that obviously she is where she is. It didn't need to be half that length, because even when kind of we get to the kind of the last act of this movie, it's a struggle to sit through it. I mean, I wanted to watch all of it because I wanted to review it, but I can totally understand why people would be turning this off. And I read a few of the reviews on IMDb, and they're all kind of ones out of 10s, and I don't think, a lot of those didn't sit through it. But I don't blame them, because the problem is that there's really nothing that happens in this movie. It's literally like going into an old people's home and just watching someone for an hour. It's essentially the same thing. You can just do that, or you can watch this film, which gives you the same experience. So I totally understand why people wouldn't want to kind of get into this movie. Now when we get to, like I said, the last act, there was a little bit more that happens, but even then it's still relatively slight. I don't think the acting was the best, if I'm honest. And that's really the only time we get any kind of sense of sort of dialogue. I think Gail Yost is okay, but although she doesn't really speak. But the sort of surrounding characters I think are a little weaker. There are a couple of effective use of gore here. In fact, I mean, there's two shots really that are fairly gory, and one of them in particular is pretty. You'll kind of think, "Oh, that's nasty," and it's done in an effective way. And I think part of that is because it's built up in this kind of like very kind of a mundane kind of like movie up until that point. So when that happens, you're thinking, "Oh, that's pretty gross," because you almost imagine your grandparents kind of doing this sort of thing, and then this a bit of gore happens, and it's a little bit disgusting. But it's certainly not a film I would say if you want to be entertained, watch. I don't really know what the market of this is. Like I've said, I think it's just if you're curious about wanting to see like a glimpse of like what it is to have senile dementia, then this will give you a kind of a look at that. And there's, like I said, there's a light bit of story in it towards the end. But that's the only way I can really recommend this film. Even though I think what it does, in a way, it does it fairly well, I just don't see the market for it. So I can understand why the filmmakers wanted to make it and kind of the message that they wanted across. But anyone who just wants to watch this as a narrative, they want to see the story progress, they want to see character development and stuff like that, it's just not here. So I would not recommend this film. So I do appreciate some artistic endeavours in this film, but as a whole, I'd have to give this movie a 3 out of 10 because I just don't think it's an enjoyable film for the vast majority of the audience here. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.